In the underworld, men do not become monsters because they are born in the dark. They become monsters in the exact fraction of a second when the last light is taken from them. The storm that hit the city on the second Tuesday of November was not a gentle rain. It was a violent, punishing downpour that turned the asphalt into a slick black mirror and drove everyone who had a home back into it. The Starlight Diner was the kind of place that caught the people who didn't. Sitting on the edge of the industrial district, the diner was a forgotten relic of the 1980s. Its neon sign buzzed with a rhythmic, dying hum, the letter R flickering like a failing heartbeat. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cheap bleached floors, burnt filter coffee, and the sharp grease of frying bacon. Clara Vance stood behind the Formica counter, a damp blue rag in her hand. She was 26 years old, though the harsh fluorescent lights and the permanent bruise-like shadows under her eyes made her look older. She wore a faded pink waitress uniform that had been washed so many times it had lost its shape. Her hands, wrapped around the rag, were raw from hot water and harsh chemicals, the knuckles red and calloused. Working the graveyard shift, from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, was not a choice. It was a survival strategy. The night shift paid an extra $1 an hour, but more importantly, the shadows of the night hid people who didn't want to be looked at too closely. Clara wiped down the counter for the 4th time, her eyes drifting to booth number 4 in the corner. Mia was sitting there, 6 years old, swallowed by an oversized gray sweater that Clara had bought from a thrift store for $2. Because the roof in the diner's back storage room had started leaking an hour ago, Clara had been forced to bring Mia out into the main dining area. The diner was mostly empty, just an exhausted truck driver asleep over his cold coffee, and the line cook, Hector, smoking out the back door. Mia was drawing. Her legs dangled off the edge of the cracked red vinyl seat, kicking back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion. To keep the draft from the front door from blowing her paper away, Mia had placed a heavy object on the corner of the sheet. It was a heavily tarnished silver bullet pendant, strung on a thick, worn leather cord. It was a brutal, ugly piece of metal to belong to a 6-year-old child, but Mia treated it with the reverence of a holy relic. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the bells above the front door violently shattered the quiet hum of the diner. The storm rushed in, carrying the icy wind, the smell of ozone, and 4 men. Clara froze, the damp rag halfway across the counter. The truck driver at the end of the bar jerked awake, took one look at the men who had just walked in, and slowly, silently slid out of his stool, leaving a $10 bill and retreating out the back door without making a sound. You didn't have to be a criminal to recognize the predators of the city. You just had to have a pulse. The men wore expensive dark suits that were ruined by the rain. But it wasn't just rain. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The cuffs of the men's trousers, the edges of their sleeves, and the knuckles of their hands were smeared with something thick, dark, and unmistakable. Blood. They moved with the casual, terrifying entitlement of men who owned whatever room they stood in. They didn't look at Clara. They didn't look at the menu. They simply walked toward the back booths to get out of the sightline of the front windows. The leader of the group, a towering man in a devastatingly expensive charcoal coat, walked past booth number 4. He didn't even register that a child was sitting there. But the man walking directly behind him was carrying a heavy, soaked black canvas duffel bag. As he passed Mia's booth, he carelessly swung the bag down, dropping it heavily onto the edge of her table to adjust his grip. The impact was violent. The cheap table shook. Mia's cardboard box of 60 crayons, the ones Clara had saved up for 2 weeks to buy her for her birthday, flew off the edge. The crayons scattered across the sticky, dirty floor like spilled coins, rolling under tables and into the grime. The man didn't apologize. He didn't even look down. He just hoisted the bag back up and kept walking. For 2 seconds, the only sound in the diner was the rain. Then, a high, clear, furious voice rang out. "You! Yes, you, the big man with the scary face. Did your mother not teach you how to say sorry?" Clara's heart stopped beating. The blood drained from her face so fast she felt dizzy. Mia had climbed onto the red vinyl seat, standing up to her full height. Her small hand was pointing straight at the back of the man who had dropped the bag. One of her pigtails had come loose hours ago, framing her fierce, scowling face. The man with the duffel bag stopped. He turned around, his expression shifting from indifference to annoyance, and then to a cold, flat stare. He looked at the 6-year-old girl. Behind him, a second man in a dark, rain-slicked coat reached smoothly under his jacket. His hand settled on something cold and heavy that did not need to be named aloud to be understood. That was Marcus Kane. He was the right hand of the devil, and Marcus Kane did not draw his hand back just because the threat was waist-high. Clara's vocal cords paralyzed. She tried to scream, to run out from behind the counter, but her legs felt like they were encased in concrete. Mia did not look at Marcus Kane's hand. Mia was entirely focused on the disrespect. "My mom," Mia said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the diner, "works for 12 hours straight when normal people are sleeping. She scrubs this floor on her knees because she says people like to see things clean." Mia took one step forward on the cushion. "And you came in here, tracking mud, and threw your bag on my table like we are trash." The diner held its breath. Slowly, the man at the very front of the group, the towering man in the charcoal coat, turned around. Damen Vale was a man who had not felt a human emotion other than rage in nearly a decade. He was taller than he had looked from behind. His dark hair was wet from the storm. But it was his eyes that made men drop their gaze. They were so pale, they were almost colorless. And right now, they were violently bloodshot, rimmed with the deep, bruising purple of a man who had not slept. A thin, vicious silver scar cut across the edge of his jawline. He wore a bespoke suit that cost more than the diner and the land it sat on, but he wore it like armor. He looked down at the child, pointing at his chest the way a man looks at a small animal that has wandered onto a battlefield. "Do you know who I am?" Daben said. His voice was low, even, the kind of gravelly baritone that usually ended conversations permanently. Mia blinked once, totally unimpressed. "No," she said. Daben held the child's gaze for 3 long seconds. He was not angry. He was calculating how quickly he could get his men out of this establishment before someone called the police about the blood. He was about to turn away when his pale eyes flicked downward. They locked onto the drawing paper on the table. And then they locked onto the heavy, tarnished piece of metal weighing the paper down. Damen Vale stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to ice. It was a silver bullet, a .45 caliber hollow point. But that wasn't what paralyzed the most dangerous man on the East Coast. It was the deep, jagged scratch running across the silver casing, the exact scar left by a pair of surgical pliers 10 years ago when the bullet had been dug out of his own right shoulder. He had put it on a leather cord. He had given it to his little sister, Elena. And 9 years ago, when Elena was taken from his car in the middle of the night, that bullet had vanished with her. Daben's bloodshot eyes snapped back up to the 6-year-old girl. His chest heaved once. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the ruthless Mafia boss shattered, revealing the agonizing, bleeding wound of a brother who had searched the earth and found nothing. Then, without turning his head, he spoke one word. "Marcus." Marcus Kane stepped forward instantly. He crouched down on the greasy, wet diner floor in his $600 Italian leather shoes. Without a word, the hardened enforcer began picking up crayons one by one, placing them back in the cardboard box with the careful precision of a man defusing a bomb. Mia. The spell broke. Clara finally found her legs. She burst through the swinging kitchen doors, her stained pink apron flying. Her face was chalk white, sheer animal terror flooding her eyes as she took in the bloody cuffs of the men's trousers and the visible bulges of firearms in their jackets. She threw herself in front of the booth, snatching Mia off the seat and shoving the child behind her legs. In the same fluid, desperate motion, Clara's hand swept across the table, grabbing the silver bullet pendant and burying it deep in the pocket of her apron. "Sir, I am so sorry," Clara stammered, her entire body shaking visibly. She kept her eyes glued to Daben's chest, too terrified to look him in the face. "She's just tired. She didn't mean any disrespect. Please, sit anywhere. Let me get your coffees. On the house. Just, please don't hurt us." Daben stared at the top of Clara's head. He stared at her trembling hands, red from hot water. He stared at the spot on the table where the silver bullet had been just a second ago. His instincts screamed at him to grab this woman by the throat, to pin her against the wall and tear the truth out of her screaming mouth. "Where did you get that necklace? Where is Alana?" But Daben looked at the way Clara was shielding the child with her own body. He saw the sheer, unadulterated, protective terror of a mother. If he used violence now, if he dragged this woman away screaming, he might destroy the only link to his sister he had found in 9 years. And, worse, if that child behind her legs was Alana's blood? Damen Vale, a man who had murdered his rivals for looking at him wrong, forced his fists to open. He gave one slow, deliberate nod. The black Cadillac pulled away from the edge of the diner 10 minutes later. It moved the way Daben Vale's cars always moved, slow and unhurried, as if the storm itself owed the vehicle the courtesy of getting out of its way. Through the tinted window, the neon signs slid past in strips of blurred red and blue. Inside the car, the silence was absolute. Marcus Kane drove with both hands firmly on the wheel. He had learned in 7 years of working as Daben's shadow that silence in the back seat was a kind of weather, and the only correct response was to wait for it to pass. He glanced up into the rearview mirror. Daben was sitting perfectly still in the plush leather seat. His hands rested on his thighs. His head was not turned toward the window. It was turned very slightly toward the rear windshield, staring at the fading neon sign of the diner they had just left behind. Marcus almost missed a red light. In 7 years, he had never once seen his boss look back. Damen Vale moved in one direction, and that direction was forward. Everything behind him was burned. And yet, 15 minutes passed. 16. When Daben finally spoke, his voice was quieter, rougher than usual, scraping against his throat like broken glass. "Marcus." "Yes, sir." "The child." Marcus waited. "Find out everything. Her name, her address, what school she goes to, what she had for breakfast, her teachers, her doctor." A long, heavy pause filled the car. "And the mother. I want her whole life on my desk, every breath she has taken." Marcus reached for the small leather notebook he kept in the driver's door. He wrote the words down in his careful military shorthand. He did not ask why. He did not ask what a late-night waitress in a stained apron and a fearless 6-year-old girl could possibly have done to earn the full, terrifying attention of Damen Vale. He just wrote. In the back seat, Daben looked down at his own hands. They were large hands, heavily scarred across the knuckles, hands that had done unspeakable work and had not trembled for a very long time. They were not trembling now. But behind his ribs, his heart was beating with a violent, irregular rhythm. His eyes were burning. For 9 years, Damen Vale had suffered from severe, medically untreatable insomnia. He had not experienced a single night of deep, dreamless sleep since that rain-slicked highway outside the city. His sister Alana had been in the passenger seat of his car. He had stopped for gas. 10 minutes, no more. When he came back with the coffee, the passenger door was open. The rain was blowing into the leather seats. Alana was gone. Only on the seat where she had been sitting lay the crushed silver bullet pendant. He had kept it, clutching it until his hands bled, until the night the police took it for evidence, and it vanished from the precinct lockup, stolen by the cartel that had taken his sister. Since that night, his brain had simply refused to shut down. The trauma had physically rewired his nervous system, trapping him in an endless, waking nightmare. He lived on microsleeps and chemical stimulants, a ghost haunting his own empire. But back in that diner, smelling the cheap filter coffee, listening to the rain hit the glass, looking at that tarnished bullet on the table, hearing the soft, panicked breathing of the waitress, Daben had felt something terrifying. For 3 seconds, sitting in that booth, surrounded by the white noise of a poor woman's life, His eyelids had grown unbearably heavy. His brain had, for the first time in 3,285 days, signaled that it was safe to rest. He needed to find out who she was. But more desperately than that, he needed to go back. 48 hours later, the Vale estate sat like a fortress on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. In a study lined with dark walnut shelves, Daben sat behind a desk that had belonged to his grandfather. The desk was completely clear. Daben did not like paper, and he did not like clutter. His mind was loud enough. When Marcus Kane knocked twice and entered, Demon noticed immediately that the gray file folder in his hand was shockingly thin. "That is everything, sir," Marcus said, setting it down. He stood at attention, his face an unreadable mask, though the tension in his broad shoulders betrayed him. Demon opened the cover. The first page was a surveillance photograph of Clara and Mia, taken through the diner window from across the street. Clara was wiping a table. Mia was asleep in the adjacent booth, curled up in her oversized sweater. "Clara Vance," Marcus read aloud, his tone clipped and professional. 26 years old. Works the graveyard shift at the Starlight Diner 6 nights a week. Earns minimum wage plus tips. Rents a tiny one-bedroom apartment in the industrial ward. Paid in cash. The girl is Mia, 6 years old. She attends a public school 3 blocks away. But that is the issue, sir. There is no before. Damon's hand went still on the page. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "Explain." "I pulled every record the state has," Marcus said. "I had Rivera hack into the federal databases. We ran facial recognition through DMV records in 5 adjoining states. Nothing. No birth certificate for the child. No hospital records. Clara's Social Security number was issued exactly 4 years and 2 months ago under a highly classified federal provision for domestic abuse survivors with sealed records. Before that day, Clara Vance and her daughter simply did not exist." Damen turned to the last page of the file. It was a high-resolution, digitally enhanced crop of the surveillance photo. The camera had focused on Clara as she leaned over the table. Hanging loosely from the collar of her faded pink uniform was the silver bullet. The jagged scratch across the casing was clearly visible. It was absolutely unmistakable. Daben's large hand came down flat on the desk. Not loud, not a violent slam, but with a sudden crushing weight that made the heavy brass lamp tremble. "Do you want me to bring them in, sir?" Marcus asked quietly. "A team can secure the mother and child in less than 20 minutes. We have soundproof rooms in the basement. She will talk." For 9 years, that had been Daben's exact protocol. Find a thread, rip it out by the root, interrogate, torture, destroy until the truth bled out. But as he looked at the photograph of the exhausted 26-year-old woman and the sleeping child, a strange, cold calculation settled over him. If Clara had forged federal identities and erased herself from the world, she was running from something terrifying. If Daben dragged her into a basement and terrorized her, she would shut down. She might lie to protect the child. And if that child was his niece, Daben could not afford a single mistake. He needed her to feel safe enough to slip up. But there was another reason. A darker, more selfish reason that Daben did not speak aloud to his enforcer. He remembered the feeling of his eyelids dropping in that diner. He remembered the chemical sedative of her humming. He was a man dying of thirst, and Clara Vance's diner was the only drop of water he had found in a decade. If he destroyed her life, he would destroy his only cure. "No," Daben said quietly. "Call off the surveillance teams. Pull everyone back." "Sir?" Marcus blinked, a rare crack in his composure. "I will handle Clara Vance myself." Fear is a loud emotion. It screams in your pulse and vibrates in your bones. But trust is terrifyingly quiet. It is built in the empty spaces between the words that are never spoken. The next night, at exactly 2 a.m, the bells above the door of the Starlight Diner chimed. Clara Vance almost dropped the stack of ceramic coffee mugs she was carrying. She looked up, her heart slamming against her ribs. Damen Vale had returned, but he was alone. No black Cadillac idling at the curb. No heavily armed enforcers standing in the rain. He had left the intimidating bespoke charcoal coat at home. He wore a plain dark waterproof jacket, black denim and heavy boots. But casual clothes did not make him less terrifying. They only highlighted the raw, predatory grace of his massive frame. His pale eyes were heavier than they had ever been, the dark circles under them bruised and absolute. He looked like a man who had fought a war for 100 years and had forgotten how to lay down his sword. The diner was entirely empty except for Hector, the line cook, who was safely hidden in the kitchen. Damen did not look at Clara. He walked straight to booth number 4, the exact booth where Mia had scolded him 2 nights ago, and sat down on the cracked red vinyl. Clara swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Her hands shook so violently she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. He knows. Her panicked brain screamed. He saw the necklace. He came back to kill us. But Mia was safe in the back room behind a locked steel door. Clara took a deep breath, forcing her face into the blank, polite mask of a tired waitress. She picked up a coffee pot and a menu and walked over to his table. "Good evening, sir," Clara said. Her voice only wavered slightly. "Coffee?" It was an excellent performance. It would have fooled 99 men out of 100. Daben was the 100th. In the single microsecond before her eyes met his, he caught the subtle shift of her weight, the way her feet braced as if preparing to sprint toward the kitchen to protect her child. "Black," Daben said. His voice was a low rasp. He did not look at the menu. Clara poured the coffee. A single drop of dark liquid splashed onto the formica table because of her trembling hand. She wiped it away instantly with her rag, terrified he would strike her for the mistake. Daben didn't even blink. He just stared out the window into the dark street. Clara retreated behind the counter. She positioned herself strategically between his booth and the kitchen doors, her hand resting inches from the panic button under the register. She waited for him to speak. She waited for him to demand answers, to pull a gun, to threaten Mia. He did none of those things. He simply sat. For an hour, the only sound in the diner was the humming of the refrigerators. Daben sat like a marble statue. He didn't drink the coffee. He didn't check his phone. He just let the silence stretch. An excruciating psychological pressure test. Clara scrubbed the counter until her knuckles bled, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. By 3:30 in the morning, the sheer, crushing exhaustion of her 12-hour shift began to override her terror. Daben hadn't moved. He seemed broken, like a massive, dangerous machine that had simply run out of power. Thinking he was perhaps just another silent, damaged man avoiding the cold, Clara's guard slipped by a fraction of an inch. She leaned against the back counter, staring blankly at the wall. Unconsciously, a soft sound drifted from her lips. She was humming. It was a low, rhythmic, mournful melody. Not an American pop song, not a nursery rhyme. It was an obscure, ancient Italian lullaby about a fisherman pulling the moon from the sea. In booth number 4, Damon's scarred hand tightened around his ceramic coffee mug with such sudden, violent force that the thick handle cracked. It was the exact same lullaby his mother had sung to them. It was the exact same lullaby his sister, Elena, used to hum when she was terrified of the dark. The sound of the rain lashing the glass, the sizzle of the grill as Hector cleaned it, the smell of cheap filter coffee and bleach, and that specific, haunting lullaby drifting from the lips of the woman who held his sister's bullet. It was a sensory cocktail that hit his traumatized, hyper-vigilant brain like a dose of surgical anesthesia. The walls of his endless waking nightmare, the blood, the screams, the guilt that kept his brain firing on high alert for 9 years suddenly dissolved. The constant flow of adrenaline that kept him violent and alive abruptly drained away, leaving only an unbearable, crushing exhaustion. Damen closed his burning eyes. He intended to just rest them for a single minute. He intended to let the lullaby wash over him before he stood up and demanded the truth. Instead, for the first time in 3,285 days, the most dangerous man on the East Coast leaned his heavy head back against the cracked vinyl of a cheap diner booth, let out a long, shuddering breath, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Clara stopped humming. She stared at the man in the booth. His chest was rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. The harsh, terrifying lines of his scarred face had softened. He looked peaceful. It was profoundly unnerving. A wolf asleep in a sheep pen. She didn't dare move. She didn't dare wake him. She just watched him for 2 entire hours, her heart in her throat. At 5:45 a.m., the sky outside began to turn a bruised purple. Dobbin's eyes snapped open. The awakening of a predator is never slow. He went from deep sleep to absolute, lethal alertness in a fraction of a second, his hand instinctively dropping to his waist. He realized where he was. He looked at the clock on the wall. He had slept for over 2 hours. Real, actual REM sleep. He felt a terrifying rush of clarity in his brain, a physical lightness he hadn't felt in a decade. He looked at Clara, who was staring at him with wide, frightened eyes from behind the counter. Daben didn't say a word. He stood up, threw a crisp $100 bill onto the table next to the cold, untouched coffee, and walked out into the dawn. That should have been the end of it. He had found her. He should have sent Marcus to drag her in the next night. But addiction is a quiet, insidious thing. The next night, Damen sat in his empty, multi-million-dollar estate, staring at the ceiling. The insomnia was back with a vengeance. The silence of his mansion was deafening. The shadows crept into the corners of his vision, bringing the ghosts of his past with them. By 1 a.m., he was tearing his study apart in a blind rage. By 2 a.m., he was walking through the doors of the Starlight Diner. Clara froze when the bells chimed. He walked to booth number 4. He sat down. She brought him black coffee. She retreated. He waited. At 3 a.m., the humming started. At 3:15 a.m., he was asleep. He woke up 2 hours later, left a $100 bill, and vanished. This became their unspoken, bizarre ritual. For 7 consecutive nights, the undisputed king of the city's criminal underworld became a ghost-haunting booth number 4. He never spoke to her. He never threatened her. He never asked about the bullet pendant. He was utterly, helplessly addicted to the only space in the world where his brain allowed him to rest. Without her diner, he suffered agonizing psychological withdrawals. With her diner, he was slowly regaining his sanity. For Clara, the sheer, paralyzing terror of the first few nights began to morph into a deeply unsettling confusion. Why was a Mafia boss coming to a greasy spoon at 2 just to sleep? Why didn't he attack them? Why did he leave $100 every time he drank a $2 coffee? By the 5th night, Clara stopped hovering near the panic button. By the 6th night, when she noticed him shivering slightly in his damp jacket after walking through the freezing rain, she made a decision that defied every survival instinct she possessed. Daben was asleep. Clara walked quietly out from behind the counter. In her hands, she carried a thick, slightly worn yellow fleece blanket she usually kept in the back for Mia. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She stepped up to the booth. He was a killer. He was the monster Elena had warned her about. But looking at the dark, bruised exhaustion on his face, Clara didn't see a monster. She saw a man who was hurting. With agonizing slowness, she draped the yellow blanket over his broad shoulders. Daben's eyes did not snap open. He did not attack her. Unconsciously, in the depths of his sleep, he leaned slightly into the warmth of the fleece, a soft sigh escaping his lips. Clara stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. For the first time, she realized that the man sitting in her booth wasn't there to hunt them. He was there because he was broken, and somehow, her diner was putting him back together. On the 7th night, the fragile, silent equilibrium they had built was shattered. It was 3:45. A MD Damen was asleep in booth number 4, the yellow fleece blanket draped over his broad shoulders. Clara was behind the counter, quietly rolling silverware into paper napkins. The diner was a sanctuary of white noise, insulated from the harsh reality of the city outside. Then, the bells above the door didn't just chime, they screamed as the heavy glass door was violently kicked open. 3 men stumbled in. They smelled of cheap liquor, stale cigarettes, and aggressive entitlement. They were local dock workers, the kind of men who worked hard, drank harder, and looked for somewhere to offload their violent frustrations when the bars closed at 3. "Hey, sweetheart," the largest of the three shouted, slapping his heavy hand onto the Formica counter. "Get us 3 burgers, fries, and whatever you got in the back that'll keep us awake." Clara's heart dropped. She glanced instinctively toward booth number 4. Daben was completely still, his breathing steady. He hadn't woken up. "I'm sorry," Clara said, keeping her voice low, desperately trying to de-escalate the situation without raising the decibel level of the room. "The grill is off for cleaning. We only have cold sandwiches and coffee." The man's bloodshot eyes narrowed. He leaned over the counter, his sour breath washing over her face. "I didn't ask for a sandwich, little girl. I asked for a burger. Go back there and turn the stove on." "I can't do that, sir," Clara said firmly, taking a step back. "Please keep your voice down. We have sleeping customers." The second man laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. He looked around the empty diner and spotted Daben's hunched form in the shadows of the back booth. "You mean that bum in the corner? Wake him up! Tell him to give up the booth." "No," Clara said, panic finally bleeding into her voice. "Please, just leave. I'm not serving you." The large man's face darkened into an ugly sneer. He reached across the counter with sudden, startling speed, his thick, greasy fingers wrapping around Clara's fragile wrist. He yanked her forward so hard she slammed her hip against the cash register. Clara gasped in pain. In her shock, her free hand knocked a stack of ceramic coffee mugs onto the floor. The crash of breaking porcelain echoed through the diner like a gunshot. In booth number 4, the yellow blanket fell to the floor. Damen Vale did not wake up slowly. He woke up exactly the way a wolf wakes up when a trap snaps shut in its territory. His pale eyes were open, and the suffocating, heavy aura of raw, unrestrained violence instantly flooded the room. The 3 men didn't notice him at first. The man holding Clara's wrist sneered, pulling her closer. "Listen to me, you stupid bitch!" He didn't finish the sentence. Daben moved with a liquid, terrifying speed that belonged in a jungle, not a cheap diner. He crossed the 30 feet of sticky linoleum without making a single sound. He didn't shout, he didn't announce his presence, he simply arrived. Daben's large, heavily scarred hand clamped onto the back of the man's thick neck. The man didn't even have time to register the touch before Daben ripped him backward. With a sickening, hollow crunch, Daben drove the man's face straight down into the sharp edge of the Formica counter. The man dropped like a stone, completely unconscious, his nose shattered, blood instantly pooling on the floor. The other 2 men froze, their drunken brains struggling to process how their leader had just been neutralized in less than a second. The second man pulled a heavy steel wrench from his jacket pocket and lunged at Daben with a furious roar. Daben didn't even blink. He sidestepped the clumsy swing, caught the man's arm, and snapped his elbow backward with a loud, brutal pop. As the man screamed, Daben drove his knee up into his ribs, cracking 3 of them, and threw him crashing through a wooden display stand. The third man backed away, his face pale with terror. He pulled a folding knife from his pocket, his hand shaking violently. Daben stood in the center of the destruction. His chest was heaving. The dark circles under his eyes made him look like a demon rising from the underworld. His knuckles were split and bleeding, but he didn't feel it. He was caught in the terrifying, blinding grip of a PTSD trauma response. The sound of the breaking plates, the screaming it had transported his brain right back to the rain-slicked highway where he had lost Elena. He wasn't seeing a drunk dock worker. He was seeing the cartel soldiers who had taken his sister. Damen picked up a jagged shard of a broken ceramic mug from the floor. He stepped toward the third man, his pale eyes completely dead, the silver scar on his jaw twitching. He was going to cut the man's throat right there in the diner. True power is not measured by the lives you have the strength to take. It is measured by the single voice that has the power to make you stop. Stop! Clara threw herself around the counter. She didn't run away. She didn't press the panic button. She threw herself directly into the path of the most dangerous man on the East Coast. She reached out with both of her hands and clamped them tightly over Daben's bloody, muscular forearm. "Stop!" Clara begged, her voice cracking, tears streaming down her face. "Damen, please, don't." For 9 years, Damen Vale suffered from severe haphophobia, the intense, paralyzing fear and hatred of physical touch. The last person who had grabbed his arm without permission was a cartel hitman, and Daben had broken his neck. If any of his own men had touched him in this state, they would have lost their hand. But as Clara's small, trembling, work-rothened hands squeezed his wrist, the blinding red rage in Daben's brain simply vanished. The warmth of her skin, the scent of vanilla and bleach, the absolute desperate pleading in her eyes, it grounded him. It pulled him out of the nightmare of the highway and brought him right back into the cheap fluorescent light of the Starlight Diner. Daben stared down at the small hands gripping his bloody arm. He couldn't breathe. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not with rage, but with a profound, terrifying shock. He didn't pull away. Daben looked at the third man, who was sobbing in terror by the door. Daben opened his fingers. The jagged piece of ceramic clattered onto the floor. "Get them out!" Daben rasped, his voice raw and hollow. "If I ever see your faces in this zip code again, I will bury you in the foundation of a bridge." The third man didn't hesitate. He grabbed his moaning friends by their collars and dragged them out the door, abandoning their car and fleeing down the rain-slicked street. The diner fell dead silent. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of the two people standing in the center of the wreckage. Clara slowly let go of his arm. She took a step back, her hands covering her mouth as she looked at the blood on the floor, the broken display case, and finally, the towering, terrifying man standing in front of her. He was a monster. She had just seen him dismantle 3 large men in 5 seconds with his bare hands. He was exactly the kind of man Elena had told her to run from. But Clara couldn't run. She looked down at Daben's hands. His knuckles were raw, bleeding heavily onto the floor. He had done this to protect her. "Sit down," Clara whispered. Daben looked at her. He didn't argue. He walked slowly back to booth number 4 and slid into the vinyl seat. He felt entirely drained, hollowed out by the adrenaline crash. A minute later, Clara emerged from the back room carrying a rusted white first aid box. She pulled up a wooden chair and sat directly across from him. She didn't say a word. She took a bottle of isopropyl alcohol, soaked a cotton pad, and gently took his massive, scarred hand in hers. Daben's muscles tensed instinctively, but he didn't pull away. Clara focused entirely on cleaning the blood from his knuckles. Her touch was incredibly gentle. She worked with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a mother used to cleaning scraped knees. Daben stared at the top of her head. He watched a loose strand of hair fall across her cheek. He felt the terrifying, agonizingly beautiful warmth of her hands holding his. He had spent 9 years alone in the dark, surrounded by violence and betrayal. Nobody had taken care of him. Nobody had touched him with anything but malice or fear. And now, the woman holding his sister's bullet was wiping his blood away with a cotton pad. "Why didn't you run?" Daben asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence. Clara didn't look up. "Because you were bleeding." "I am a dangerous man, Clara." "I know," Clara whispered. She pressed a bandage over his split knuckle. "But you were wearing the blanket I gave you, and you didn't wake up until they touched me." Daben's chest tightened so painfully he thought his ribs might crack. He looked at her throat, where he knew the silver bullet hung beneath her uniform. He was going to ask. He had to ask. The wall between them had finally crumbled. "Clara," Daben started, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to ask you about—" "Hey, back off." Hector, the line cook, burst through the kitchen doors holding a rusted unloaded shotgun he kept under the meat freezer. He aimed it wildly at Daben, his hands shaking. "I called the cops! They're coming! Get away from her!" Daben closed his eyes, exhaling a long, slow breath. The spell was broken. The real world had intruded. He pulled his hand back, from Clara's gentle grip. He stood up, towering over the terrified line cook. He didn't even look at the gun. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, and dropped them onto the broken counter to pay for the damages. Damen looked back at Clara one last time. "Keep the door locked," he said softly. And then he walked out into the rain. When Damen stepped onto the wet sidewalk, a black Cadillac instantly pulled up to the curb. Marcus Kane threw open the rear door. Damen slid into the back seat, his jaw tight. "I told you to pull the surveillance teams, Marcus. I told you I was coming here alone." Marcus turned around in the driver's seat. His face was grim, a terrifyingly rare expression for the hardened enforcer. "Sir, I didn't disobey you," Marcus said, his voice tense. "I wasn't tracking you. I was tracking the Volkov family." Daben's blood ran cold. The Volkovs, the Russian syndicate that had orchestrated the hit on his car 9 years ago. The men who had taken Alana. "What about them?" Damen asked softly, his tone dropping an octave into pure, lethal danger. "They've noticed your routine," Marcus said, holding out a tablet. On the screen was a grainy security image of the Starlight Diner, taken from a camera across the street. "They know you've been visiting a diner in the industrial ward every night at 2 a.m., completely alone, without your security detail." Marcus paused, swallowing hard. "Sir, they don't care why you're there. They're mobilizing a strike team. They are going to hit the diner tomorrow night." Damen Vale looked at his bandaged knuckles. The quiet, gentle touch of Clara's hands still burned on his skin. "Then let them come," Damen whispered. "Family is not just the blood you are born with. Sometimes it is the blood a stranger bleeds to keep you alive." The following night, the Starlight Diner looked exactly as it always did. The neon R flickered in the dark. Hector was cleaning the grill. Clara was wiping down the counter. But outside, the industrial ward had become a ghost town. Not a single car passed on the street. Not a single stray dog barked in the alleys. The silence was absolute, heavy, and engineered. Damen Vale was not sitting in booth number 4. He was standing on the roof of a deserted warehouse directly across the street. He wore a matte black tactical vest over his clothes. In his hands, he held a high-powered thermal imaging rifle. Below him, hidden in the shadows of the alleyways, Marcus Kane and 30 of the syndicate's most lethal enforcers waited. Damen was using the diner as bait. He was using himself as bait. But he had ensured that a perimeter of absolute death surrounded the woman and the child inside. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the trap was sprung. 3 black, unmarked SUVs rounded the corner with their headlights off. They didn't slow down. They accelerated straight toward the front windows of the Starlight Diner. The Volkov syndicate didn't care about collateral damage. They assumed Daben was inside, sitting in his usual booth, and they intended to turn the building into a slaughterhouse. "Now," Daben said into his radio. Before the lead SUV could even mount the curb, the night erupted. Sniper fire from the warehouse roof shattered the engine block of the first vehicle. It violently fishtailed, crashing into a street lamp in a shower of sparks. Marcus's men stepped out of the shadows, unleashing a deafening, coordinated barrage of suppressed automatic fire. The second and third SUVs were shredded before their doors could even open. Daben didn't flinch as the chaos unfolded below him. He kept his thermal scope locked on the back alley behind the diner. There, while the main force attacked the front, 2 thermal signatures had slipped through the back alley, moving toward the diner's rear-loading door. They were trying to flank. Danen dropped the rifle. He didn't take the stairs. He leapt from the fire escape, dropping 15 feet into the alley below, landing with a heavy, bone-jarring impact. He drew his sidearm and sprinted toward the diner's back door. Inside the diner, Clara had shoved Mia under the heavy steel prep table the second the first gunshot rang out. The glass of the front windows had miraculously held, reinforced by steel shutters Hector had pulled down at the first sign of trouble. But the back door, the rusted metal door leading to the alley, was being kicked violently. "Stay here," Clara whispered to Mia. her voice shaking so badly she could barely form the words. She kissed the top of the girl's head. "Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Clara stood up. She had no gun. She had no combat training. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a massive cast-iron frying pan from the stove, and stood in front of the prep table, shielding the child underneath. With a sickening crack, the deadbolt gave way. The metal door flew open. Two massive men in dark tactical gear poured into the kitchen. They carried short-barreled rifles. They didn't look like street thugs. They looked like professional killers. The first man spotted Clara standing in the center of the kitchen. He raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Clara didn't scream. She just gripped the frying pan tighter and braced herself for the impact. The impact never came. A shadow moved through the open doorway with the speed of a falling guillotine. Damen Vale slammed into the first gunman from behind. He grabbed the barrel of the rifle, forcing it upward just as it fired, sending a burst of bullets into the ceiling. In the same motion, Damen brought the heavy grip of his pistol down in a crushing arc against the man's temple. The man collapsed. The second gunman spun around, leveling his weapon. Damen didn't even raise his gun. He lunged forward, closing the distance before the man could pull the trigger. He slammed the gunman against the industrial refrigerator. The sheer, terrifying impact rattled the heavy stainless steel. Damen drove his knee into the man's stomach, then grabbed him by the throat and threw him violently out into the alley. Damen stepped over the threshold, firing two quick, silenced shots into the dark. The kitchen fell silent. Outside, the gunfire had abruptly ceased. The ambush was over. Damen turned back into the kitchen. His chest was heaving, his dark hair falling into his wild, pale eyes. He looked at Clara. She was still standing in front of the prep table, trembling violently, the frying pan still raised in her white-knuckled grip. "Are you hurt?" Damen asked, his voice rough and breathless. Clara shook her head rapidly. She couldn't speak. Damen took a step toward her to check for injuries. As he did, his foot stepped on something on the tiled floor. It wasn't a bullet casing. It didn't sound right. It made a dull, heavy clink against the tile. Damen looked down. During the violent struggle, one of the gunmen's rifles had snagged on Clara's uniform. The worn leather cord she kept tucked under her collar had snapped. Lying in a small puddle of melted ice and blood on the kitchen floor was the silver bullet pendant. The world stopped spinning. The adrenaline that had been surging through Damen's veins turned to liquid nitrogen. He slowly reached down and picked it up. He wiped the blood from the casing with his thumb. There it was, the jagged scratch. Damen's breathing stopped. He slowly raised his head, his pale, bloodshot eyes locking onto Clara. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was a terrifying, suffocating desperation that was infinitely more dangerous. He closed the distance between them in two massive strides, backing her against the stainless steel prep table. He held the bullet up, his large, scarred hand shaking violently. "Where?" Damen rasped, his voice tearing out of his throat. "Did you get this?" Clara was trapped. She looked at the blood on Damen's hands. She looked at the dead man on the floor. Her mind flashed back to the warning she had been given 5 years ago. If they find her, they will kill her. "I bought it," Clara lied, tears spilling down her cheeks. "At a pawn shop. Please, just let me go. Don't lie to me." Damen roared. The sound was deafening, a wounded, agonizing roar that shook the kitchen walls. He slammed his hand against the counter next to her head. "I dug this bullet out of my own shoulder. I put it around my sister's neck 9 years ago. Where is Elena?" Clara froze. The tears stopped. She stared at the terrifying Mafia boss, her brain struggling to process the word he had just screamed. "Sister." "Elena was your sister?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Damen's hand dropped. His face contorted in agony. "Yes, she was my baby sister. They took her from me. Where is she, Clara?" Clara's legs finally gave out. She sank to the floor, her back sliding down the cold steel cabinet. She covered her face with her hands, a deep, racking sob tearing through her chest. 5 years of terror, of hiding, of scrubbing floors on the night shift. All of it crashed down on her at once. "She's gone," Clara wept, her voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. "I'm so sorry. She's gone." Damen stopped breathing. A physical blow to the chest could not have hurt more. He staggered backward, catching himself on the edge of the counter. "How do you know?" 5 years ago, Clara choked out, looking up at him through her tears. "I was 21. I was a nursing student, working night shifts at an underground clinic in the South Ward to pay my tuition. One night, a black van pulled up into the alley. They dumped a woman at the back door. She had been shot. She had been kept captive for years, and when she finally managed to escape, they shot her." Daben closed his eyes. A single, agonizing tear slipped down his scarred face. "She was carrying a baby," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "The baby was only a year old. Alana was bleeding out on the table. The doctor ran away because he knew the cartel was coming to finish the job. I was the only one left." Clara looked at the silver bullet in Daben's hand. "She pulled that necklace off," Clara said. "She shoved it into my hand. She grabbed my uniform. I will never forget her face. She said, 'Take my baby. Erase your name. If the Volkovs find her, they will use her to destroy my brother. Hide her, please.'" The silence in the kitchen was heavier than gravity. "She died holding my hand," Clara whispered. "I heard the tires screeching in the alley. I took the baby, and I climbed out the bathroom window. I never went back to nursing school. I bought a forged identity. I moved to the industrial ward. I've worked the graveyard shift for 5 years, just trying to keep her hidden." Damen Vale looked at the small, fragile, 26-year-old woman sitting on the dirty tile floor in a faded pink uniform. He was the head of the most powerful syndicate on the East Coast. He had an army of killers at his disposal. He had millions of dollars. He had searched the earth for 9 years. And yet, the person who had fought his war, the person who had protected his sister's final legacy, the person who had sacrificed her youth, her career, and her safety, was this exhausted waitress. Slowly, movement from under the prep table caught Daben's eye. Mia crawled out from under the steel counter. The 6-year-old girl didn't look at the dead man on the floor. She walked straight over to Clara, threw her small arms around Clara's neck, and glared fiercely up at the towering Mafia boss. "Don't you yell at my mom," Mia said, her voice shaking but defiant. Daben looked at the child. He looked past the thrift store sweater and the messy pigtails. He looked at the shape of her jaw, the fierce, uncompromising set of her brow, and the pale, striking color of her eyes. They were the exact same eyes as the man staring down at her. They were Vale eyes. Daben's legs gave way. The most dangerous man in the city dropped to his knees on the bloody kitchen floor. He didn't care about his bespoke suit. He didn't care about the enforcers securing the perimeter outside. He reached out with a trembling hand, slowly, terrified she would pull away. He gently placed his hand against Mia's cheek. The little girl blinked, surprised by the extreme gentleness of the giant man. "You're safe," Daben whispered, his voice cracking, the tears finally falling freely down his face. "You are both so safe now." He pulled the child into a desperate, crushing hug, burying his face in her shoulder. For the first time in 9 years, Damen Vale wept. He wept for his sister, and he wept for the overwhelming, staggering relief of finding her blood alive. Clara watched them, the tears continuing to fall. But for the first time in 5 years, the crushing weight of terror that sat on her chest began to lift. When Daben finally pulled back, he wiped his face. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the absolute, unshakable authority of a king who had reclaimed his throne. He looked at Clara. He saw the bruise on her wrist where the thug had grabbed her the night before. He saw the permanent shadows under her eyes from 5 years of the graveyard shift. Daben stood up. He reached down and offered his large, scarred hand to Clara. She looked at it for a moment, then placed her hand in his. He pulled her effortlessly to her feet. He didn't let go of her hand. "My men will clean this up," Damen said quietly. "Where is your coat?" Clara blinked, confused. "My coat! It's in the locker. But my shift doesn't end until 7. Damen looked at the flickering fluorescent lights of the greasy kitchen. He looked at the heavy mop bucket Clara had been dragging around for 5 years. Without breaking eye contact with her, Damen reached out with his free hand, drew his pistol, and fired a single shot into the diner's electrical box on the wall. The lights shattered. The buzzing neon R outside died instantly. The diner was plunged into silence. "Your shift is over," Damen said, his voice a low, gravelly promise that sent a shiver down her spine. "Pack your things, Clara. Both of you. We are going home."